today. And so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. We are hoping that we will have a good, clean recording, and we will make that available on our website at the Alabama Center for Dispute Resolution once we go through and verify that everything worked out okay. So having said all of that, I think that covers our housekeeping rules. I am pleased to introduce you to Anna Rappaport. I first met Anna at the American Bar Association's Dispute Resolution Section Spring Conference in April of this year in Washington, D.C. I attended a session that was called Good Things Come to Those Who Ask, which discussed a model for effective referrals and requests. And when I attended that session, I thought Anna would be great to help out our neutrals in the state of Alabama, and she would be a perfect keynote speaker to launch our free webinars. Anna is the founder and principal of Excelleration Coaching. She's a former lawyer with 18 years experience coaching lawyers, and she has 11 years experience mentoring and training other coaches. And she helps her clients create strategic business and career plans suited to their strengths and preferences, helps them find the time and energy to implement plans and enhance their business communications. And she's a regular publisher in the American Bar Association's Law Practice Today magazine and the National Law Review, and she's a frequent speaker around the country. So I am so grateful that Anna has agreed to join us today. And at this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Eileen, for such a lovely introduction. I am delighted to be here with all of you. Obviously, it's nice when we can have interaction. Unfortunately, we can't, but if you feel free to reach out to me, send questions. If we don't have time to get to everything, I'd be delighted to hear from all of you. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you a little bit more about myself so that you understand who I am and the perspective that I'm bringing to this topic. So one of the big areas I work on with people is business development. And a lot of people who do this kind of coaching, they come from a sales background. They were, fantastically successful at sales, and now they're helping people improve their sales skills. I'm kind of the opposite. I started off doing personal growth-oriented transformational coaching, which is inspiring and it changes lives. But similar to transformational mediation, it can be a little bit hard to explain to people, and not everyone's interested. So it's actually a real challenge from a business development standpoint. So also, like all of you, I want to make a difference in the world. And I found that I was only communicating with people about the transformational part of coaching. I was dramatically limiting the impact that I could make. Basically because I was preaching to the choir, right? The people who are already on board with that kind of thing think it's great, but there are many more people out there in the world who could use support, but who aren't really accustomed to that kind of approach or that kind of language. So over time, what I realized was that business development is a fantastic lens through which to gain insight and personal growth. And that's not going to apply for everyone, right? Some people just want some structure and some facilitative coaching, right? They want to improve their business and they just like a little bit of sort of more facilitative approach, which is fine. But I find that for a lot of people, business development is intrinsically tied in with issues of identity, power, and what they really think is possible in the world. So that's why I find this a really inspiring area to work on with people. There is some noise in the background, and I don't know, obviously I don't know where it's coming from, but if you're not on mute, if you could just check and make sure that you're on mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. That sounded better. So as a lawyer, right, working with lawyers, you may wonder how I ended up with a specialty in ADR. And it's basically that I had a friend who was very active in the American Bar Association dispute resolution section who really pulled me in. As a mediator, she pointed out to me that mediators and arbitrators really need a lot of assistance with business development. And also she knew that I'd gone through mediation training, so she knew that it was something I already had an interest in. And so I attended my first mediation conference, and what I realized was that I love mediators, right? We're very much on the same page, have the same values, all of that. So it ended up just being a really good fit. And so for the last 4 years, I've been very active in the mediation and arbitration world. And now I'm vice chair of membership for the ABA dispute resolution section. So now we're going to move on to the content. And so this first slide is a little bit silly, but I think it's a good reminder. You see here a snail riding on a turtle, and he is saying, OMG, slow down, you're going to get us killed. And this is just a reminder that not everyone sees the world the way you do. The person you're talking to may perceive a situation very differently. And you see this all the time. I know that everyone on this call knows that when it comes to mediation and arbitration, but it's also important to remember that it's applicable in the realm of business development. So, and this next slide is just a reminder of the most fundamental point about marketing, that marketing and business development are all about getting people to know, like, and trust you. On one hand, this is marketing 101, but on the other hand, it's something that people tend to forget. People get sidetracked when thinking about all of the different initiatives they may have, online marketing or social media or all the networking they're doing. And sometimes people just forget this most basic principle. So everything we're talking about today is going to lead back one way or another to this basic principle. Now we're going to go ahead and go through the 11 most common mistakes that mediators and arbitrators make when they are trying to develop a practice. So the first one is not being authentic. Now, on one hand, this seems kind of funny because I think mediators overall tend to be among the most authentic people. They're very focused on genuine connection and all of that. But I find that even people who are really committed to being genuine and authentic can fall into what I call the sales trap. And this is when you think that in order to sell yourself, you have to look and act a certain way. Again, we're still getting a lot of background noise. If at all possible, if people could try and mute themselves. Anyway, but people tend to envision that successful salespeople, they do certain things. They work the room. They give their cards out to everyone. They slap you on the back. They might be a little fake or a little pushy. And although on one hand, most people are somewhat repulsed by that image, they also sometimes feel like that's what they're supposed to be doing if they were really serious about marketing and sales and selling themselves. So this is just a reminder that people have a lot of different approaches to becoming known, liked, and trusted, but for all of them, being yourself is a really important piece of it, right? One person might be very direct and concise, and that approach is very attractive to some people, right? And that's a really good way of selling themselves. Someone else may spend all their time when they talk to people asking questions, getting to know them, creating connection in that regard, and that can work as well. But whatever you choose as your approach, it's just important to remember that it really needs to be something that's authentic, and that there are authentic approaches, a whole range of authentic approaches that can be very effective. The next thing, the next mistake people tend to make is they tend to stick to their comfort zone rather than pursuing the things that feel risky. So in 2010, I decided to move to Turkey, which was sort of a peculiar thing to do. But my father had died, and I really felt the need for a major life change. People respond to loss in different ways, and that was my response to loss. And so I moved to a country where I didn't speak the language, I didn't know anybody, and I didn't really understand anything about the culture, to be honest, which arguably is an insane thing to do. But what I discovered was that I ended up finding clients so much faster than I ever anticipated. And what I realized was that this was largely because people were attracted by what they saw as my courage. They saw this as just an incredibly brave thing for a woman to move to a foreign country, you know, without any support network and just start a business. And that, obviously, that's an extreme example, but this applies for all kinds of courageous actions. People tend to find that when they're out there, putting themselves out there in the world, they tend to attract people. People respect that and want to be around them. So all the things that I'm talking about today, I'm going to talk about creating a niche, finding ways to stand out, getting mentors, all of those things really take courage. Right? You could pick the wrong strategy. You could reach out to the wrong person. There's all kinds of reasons why these things can feel risky, and you may question whether you're making the right decision. But if you read literature about strategy, it's full of examples of companies that make some clear choice that goes against the conventional wisdom of the industry and creates huge successes while the competition falters. But so it's great to see those examples, and this is why anyone who talks about marketing, sales, business development, any of these areas really recommends that, you know, people take what's fundamentally courageous action. But it's still no accident that even really big companies often don't have genuine strategies, because most of the time, right, no one wants to be wrong. It feels risky to put yourself out there because maybe it'll be a mistake. So pretty much every aspect of building a successful practice takes courage, right? Going out and doing speaking events, writing articles, asking people you know to consider referring you. All of those things are scary, maybe not for everyone, but to some people at least. And what I find working with people is that the things that my clients are most nervous about or most reluctant to do are very often the same things that are going to end up being most valuable and end up bringing them the most success. So, you know, for some people, when they feel scared or uncomfortable, they take it as a sign that they're going down the wrong path. They're like, whoa, this is scary and uncomfortable. I should take a right turn and move away from that thing. So some of you might relate to that attitude, while others may be thinking the exact opposite, that actually every major success you've had in life was when you took a risk and tried something uncomfortable. So you take a fear as a sign that there's a new challenge for you to overcome. So this point I'm making here is really for people in the first camp who think, oh, that's scary, let me avoid it. This is me reminding you that that's usually a sign that there's great potential. The next point is that a lot of people don't really use their existing networks. And people often feel that it would be a lot more comfortable or a lot more appropriate to target people who they don't know as well, right? In the ADR field, you hear a lot of talk about the importance of writing and speaking. And while those are important tools for expanding a reputation and your credentials as an expert, the truth is that a lot of people who are very visible as experts in mediation or arbitration, they are still struggling to create full-time ADR practices. Meanwhile, those who focus on their existing relationships and leveraging their networks, they may not have the same visibility, but they are very often the ones who start making a living at it much faster. They have full-time practices. That happens much faster than those who focus on all the visibility things. Now, of course, there are many caveats here, right? How successful a person is going to be in leveraging their relationships and existing networks varies according to a whole range of factors. My intention here is just to provide a counterpoint to what I often see as some of the conventional wisdom in some EDR circles. The final point to make here is that people often use the need for neutrality as an excuse not to ask their network for business. Now, while it's completely understandable, and of course neutrality is supremely important in this field, it's still a mistake. There are people out there who already know, like, and trust you. So you already done all the preliminary work, I mean, in the last however many years, to develop those relationships. Right? This is the low-hanging fruit. And these people know, like, and trust you. And failure to pick that low-hanging fruit will lead to years of frustration and struggle. And the people who do ask their networks for business find that it generally works out fine in terms of neutrality. I mean, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, right? There's no guarantees, but people disclose pre-existing relationships the same as they would in any other case. And it ends up not being the problem that most people anticipate. The next mistake that people tend to make is not having a clear niche. Now, you are probably all aware that there's a lot of competition for paid mediation and arbitration work. In 2018, Urska Velikonja wrote an article called Making Peace and Making Money in the ABA Dispute Resolution magazine. And in that article, she talked about her research in the ADR field. And what she found was that the job market for private neutrals is similar to markets for entertainers or professional athletes, right? Rather than being similar to typical markets for professional jobs. And that means that a very tiny percentage are super successful while the vast majority are struggling. So although that research is 10 years old at this point, there seems to be every indication that the markets are getting even more competitive rather than less. So it is most likely truer than ever. So if you're in a relatively small market, you know, some of you may be in smaller towns where being a generalist works just fine as a mediator or arbitrator. So it might not seem essential right now, but the ADR world is changing very quickly. And even if you can manage a successful practice today as a generalist, there's a very good chance that that's going to change in another 5 years. I've seen successful mediators have their practices decline dramatically when competition increases. So your best way of staying relevant and sought after in the marketplace is to have a very clear-cut area of expertise. And that's really what I'm talking about mostly with having a niche. It's a way of distinguishing yourself from other neutrals who are out there. And these are the reasons. These are the fundamental reasons why it's important. So clients want experts. The fact that you are a mediator and you can mediate pretty much anything is not going to matter to most clients. I mean, they just don't really get it typically, and they are much, much more comfortable when they have someone who has a ton of experience with the subject matter of their topic. And if you think about it this way, it makes sense. If you were having brain surgery, you would want the specialist. You wouldn't want a general surgeon, even if that person was extraordinarily competent. You want a brain surgeon. Right? This is especially true for higher dollar value mediations, right? And arbitrations, right? People want specialists. And by, business people want specialists especially. And by business people, I'm including lawyers. The next thing is that it narrows the competition. Instead of competing against all the mediators in Alabama or in Montgomery or Mobile or wherever you are, you're only competing against those few people who have the same specialty that you are. It also focuses your attention. This is something people don't usually think about, but it's really important. There are a lot of conferences you could attend, a lot of organizations that you could get involved with or where you could speak, a lot of choices for how to spend your time and energy. And when you are trying to develop a practice, well, many people find themselves going in a lot of different directions. But when you get clear that you're going to focus on IP litigation or construction disputes or multicultural divorce, right, whatever it is, when you know what your clear focus is, suddenly it becomes very obvious which opportunities you should spend your time on. The next thing is that it leverages your client referrals. So if someone in your field is looking for a mediator and they ask around and they hear your name, mediator or arbitrator, right? They hear your name, they will consider hiring you. But if you are so well known in your community that they hear your name from multiple people, then you go from being just one option to being the obvious choice, right? So this ability to dominate a niche is absolutely impossible unless you really choose to focus and drill down in a particular subject area and community. So it also multiplies name recognition and makes you top of mind. So the principle here is basically the same reason that TV and radio ads play over and over. It's the repeated exposure that makes people remember. So they meet you at a networking event, right? Maybe then a couple months later, they see you speak. Then they see that you're listed as a leader of the organization, right? A year later, they see that you wrote an article, right? It's this repeated exposure within the same market, the same community, the same types of issues that has them start to see you as a leader and an expert in that area, which makes you extraordinarily desirable as a neutral. I should add a little caveat here that I'm using advertising to make a point about repeated exposure, not promoting the use of advertising. Right? When it comes to professional services, advertising is by far the least effective form of business development. And the final thing is that when you are not competing with everyone, right, when you have a more narrow niche, it increases the opportunities for collaboration and referrals. So just to be clear, I know I'm spending a while on this niche idea, but it's really important. Just to be clear what I am talking about here, when I talk about a niche, what I mean is you're aiming to be the go-to person for a certain type of case. So that can be maybe, employment law cases that involve gender bias in Mobile, or multi-party disputes involving the aerospace industry across the United States, or divorces involving special needs in Birmingham. But you want something that's narrow enough so that the people in those areas might talk to each other. When they start looking for someone, you can stand out as the expert who's the person to go to. Small enough for you to win, but large enough for you to make good money. And the other thing is that just because something's outside your niche doesn't mean you have to say no to it. Right? I mean, when I talk about focusing on a niche, it doesn't mean necessarily saying no to other opportunities. It just means that your proactive marketing efforts and how you're selling yourself are directed towards certain kinds of cases. The things that tend to come up for people, because people tend to have a lot of issues around the idea of having a niche. So the most common fears that I hear are, if you do construction mediation or real estate mediation, will that turn people off who are looking to mediate a regular contract dispute? The truth is it might. That is a possibility. But typically, it's going to attract a whole lot more people than it repels. And, your biggest fans, the people who think you're absolutely fabulous and who send you work regularly, maybe your former boss or your mother or someone who you've worked with on a lot of cases, like those people are going to continue to send you business. Like, again, you don't have to say no to those things if you don't want to. The next concern people tend to have is that they don't have enough expertise in a particular area to justify selling themselves that way, right? Oh, well, I've only done 3 mediations on this subject. How can I write an article about it? Or, what if someone asks me how many of these kinds of cases I've done? And typically people don't ask those questions. If someone does, I certainly wouldn't lie. You might say, well, I've just decided this is my expertise. You can answer in a general way. You don't have to say I've only done 3 or something, but it is almost never an issue. But people worry that they don't actually have enough enough knowledge to justify promoting themselves as an expert. But the truth is, that is how people tend to develop expertise. They say, hey, this seems to work for me, and then they go with it. And, you know, whatever knowledge you have and insights you have, I mean, doing 3 solid cases in one area, you can have a lot of information and knowledge. It's really enough to get you started. The final thing I hear from people is that they worry about being bored, right? Oh, it's the same case all the time. I'm going to be bored. And the one question here is, do you need to make a living? Right? Because if you don't, and some people are retiring or something, and they don't need to make a living, and that's absolutely fine, then, you know, do what you want. But if people do, then of course, first things first, right? Make sure you have enough cases coming in, and then you can worry about expanding to other areas. But the truth is that even though people worry about being bored, by having a more narrow expertise, they end up getting more interesting, more challenging cases, and boredom ends up not really being an issue. The next thing that, the next mistake people tend to make is not having a unique selling point. The absolute biggest problem for most mediators or arbitrators, well, mediators especially, but in business development, is believing that they are interchangeable with their competitors. But if you think about it, how many of you have a mechanic that you work with, right? And you wouldn't want to go anywhere else. What about a doctor or a hairdresser? I've asked this question of large groups, and very often, if I ask people how many people have a hairdresser that they really don't want to give up, maybe half the room raises their hands. So, I mean, a hairdresser, right? That doesn't have to do with your health. There's no repercussions for your family or for your business or financial well-being. And yet, people are very attached to their hairdressers. So why would mediation or arbitration services be any different? Right? You have some special qualities that are going to make certain people want to work with you. And you just need to figure out what they are so that you can make the most of it. Now, it is, it's often very hard to see this ourselves, right? Here are some ways, some things to be thinking about to help you identify a unique selling point. Maybe you have a particular skill or an unusual approach, or maybe you have an unusual work history or set of experiences, or there's something in your background that makes you stand out, or there's some unusually, maybe you're unusually caring or particularly conscientious, right? Some people just have a knack for connecting with people, and there's just something so lovely about the way they interact, right? It's hard to define, but it's still a really, really valuable quality. Other people are super responsive. They respond so fast and so effectively. Lawyers really appreciate that. I mean, other people do as well. But, you know, that's something that's not a small thing. You might take these qualities you have for granted, but others really appreciate them. But it's very often like, you know, it's one thing to ask yourself these questions, but actually identifying your unique qualities can be a bit challenging. I led a workshop a few years ago, and people were working together in small groups and helping each other to craft a way to communicate about their unique selling points. And one group called me over to help because one woman was trying to transition into environmental law after years working on other practice areas. And given that she was so new, they just didn't know how to help her. Now, it so happened that this woman and I had had a conversation before the workshop started in which she mentioned to me that years earlier, she had worked with an NGO in Peru trying to save the rainforest. Now, she had worked with an NGO in Peru trying to save the rainforest. She wants to transition into environmental work. She can't think of any unique experience, anything she's done that stands out, right? I mean, it makes a great story. It shows that she's had this ongoing commitment for many, many years, and yet she was completely blind to it. So If you're having trouble identifying what makes you special or different, you're not alone. And one good approach is to really talk to people who know you well, as they will be able to help you identify those things, because you may be too close to it to be able to see it yourself. The next thing that is something that people often don't do that helps them with business development is making an effort to be memorable. The fundamental thing here is that if they don't remember you, they are not going to hire you or refer you. Now, this picture is a little bit ridiculous, as I recognize, right? I'm not recommending that you be like a butterfly, unicorn, rainbow kitten, right? It's a little extreme. But the question is, how do you be memorable and stand out without being weird or unprofessional? And it might surprise you, but there actually is an answer. The answer is by being specific, using simple words, and telling stories. And by stories, I don't mean, talking for 10 minutes about, whatever. It can just be a sentence or two, but they do have to be specific and describe things in a way that people can visualize. So this is what your brain looks like when you hear abstract words. And this is what your brain looks like when you hear specific, concrete words. You can see there's a whole lot more, neurons firing, a whole lot more brain activity when you're hearing specific, concrete words. I mean, look at this example. So I mediate probate cases, right? I mean, that's all well and good, but it's going to be in one ear, out the other, right? Not a whole lot of neurons firing, because you just don't think about it. Like, yeah, you know what probate is, whatever, but it doesn't mean that much to you. It doesn't, cause you to think. Whereas if somebody says, you know how after someone dies, the family members can be at each other's throats over the inheritance? Well, I help people resolve those issues in a way that helps them repair the relationship rather than tear it further apart by going to court. Right? That's something people can relate to. Maybe they've had that kind of experience, or they don't have a great relationship with their sister and they're a little worried about it, or maybe they have a friend who's had that experience. So when there's specific things that are being discussed, it prompts your mind to process it on a different level. And when you're thinking, oh, wait, I've had that experience. Oh, who do I know who's had that experience? Oh, that's interesting. It relates to an article I wrote, whatever, or read. That those are the things that make people really think, really remember you, and then makes it a whole lot more likely that you're going to actually get referred. The seventh mistake people tend to make is not seeking out mentors. Now, we all think of mentors as a source of information and advice, which is obviously important, but also remember that they can be a source of referrals as well, right? If someone is very successful as a mediator or arbitrator and they're unavailable for a case, they may very well think of you, and they could easily refer significant amounts of business your way if you sufficiently impress them and they're someone they want to help and support. Now, of course, some organizations will offer to match you with mentors, but this is an area where being proactive is really important. And there's like at conferences and all kinds of situations, seeking out advice, asking people for coffee, all of those things. People are usually very open to it and happy to provide advice. And if you can create a good connection with someone, you can turn it into a more significant, longer-term relationship. And I think it's important to remember to think of this as a two-way street. It's really a relationship like any other, where you want to find ways to contribute to them just as they are helping you. And even though people sometimes think, well, I'm young or I'm inexperienced and I don't really have that much to offer, the truth is you very well may. You're involved in organizations, you have ideas, maybe you're good at social media. You probably have things and ways that you can support and contribute to the other person as well. So always keeping in mind, looking at that is an important piece of it. And I was on a panel several years ago with a woman who developed a successful mediation practice straight out of law school, which you may have been told is impossible, but she is evidence that it's not. And she's a mediator in Houston. And one of the things that she did to help get her practice off the ground was to be very proactive in terms of finding mentors. And she tells a story about how she really wanted to meet someone who was one of the leaders in the mediation field and who she had studied during her mediation training. They'd read books and discussed this person. She thought he was great. And she found out that he was speaking at a conference in Italy. Now, this is someone who didn't speak that much, who was sort of hard to, I guess, who just mostly mediated and wasn't off doing a whole lot of things publicly. But she found out he was speaking at a conference in Italy. So she decided to go to that conference, even though she did not speak Italian. So she flies across the world and started talking to him at the networking event. And he was, impressed by her, how proactive she was. And he's now one of her mentors. He provides advice, sends her business. This is another example where courageous, bold action tends to produce results. And there's many ways you can impress potential mentors. This is just one sort of extreme example, but that's something to be thinking about, is putting forth your best qualities so that the other person thinks, wow, I really want to help and support this person. The next mistake people tend to make is not choosing a strategy. Now, this may seem repetitive with some of the things I talked about before, but it's a little bit different, right? Even once you have a niche, it's still important to choose your actions in a thoughtful and forward-looking manner. So say your potential clients are in the construction industry, right? You plan to speak at construction industry conferences. Great. But that alone does not make a strategy, right? What topics are you going to speak on? Who else is going to be on the panels? How are your credentials going to play with the audience? In a way, figuring out how best to position yourself in the market, it's a puzzle, and it takes real strategic thinking as well as trial and error to figure out the best approach. The next thing is what I think of as dig deep and evolve. So in some ways, being a mediator, and to some extent arbitrator, but this is most evident, I think, with mediation, it calls you to be superhuman. You have to listen to people at a level that is way beyond the way most people listen. You have to manage your own reactions far more than most people even realize is possible, right? You may have been born with gifts in that area, but to be really great, you need to practice and develop those skills. I mean, it's a whole range of skills, but those are a couple examples. But the same is true for business development. Some people are naturally comfortable meeting new people, right? They're helpful and friendly and natural networkers. Some people may be great at remembering people's names or staying organized, or some people are born for public speaking, right? Almost everyone has some qualities that are useful for business development, and almost no one is blessed with all of it. So while there are a few people who just get lucky or have that magic combination of qualities, for most people, becoming really great in this area is a matter of digging deep and shifting their mindset, right? Learning new skills and shifting how they approach these things. So if, for example, one of my clients he's very personable. He's really fun to talk to, and you would think he would be fantastic at networking. However, because of the way he grew up and the attitudes of his family, he associated selling his services with arrogance, right? And he had some really strong feelings about being arrogant, right? He didn't want to be one of those jerks. And we worked together for a few months, and he was able to really shift his thinking. And now he's become very comfortable developing business. I mean, he's not a jerk. You know, he's a nice guy, the same as he was before, but he had to shift his mind. And it really takes digging deep into yourself to be able to shift one's perspective on things. And so while we may be willing to dig deep in some areas, people don't always realize that it's also valuable in the area of business development. This next area, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because it's such a huge topic in and of itself. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention it. The best way to have a successful business is getting as many clients as possible from referrals and repeat business. So great client service is key. And I mean, there's always ways to continually improve one's skills and service. You can be doing this for 10 years or 20 years and still get insights about how you can do better. And it's that process of always looking for how to connect with people better, how to overcome those obstacles which you are always facing in mediations. Like that ongoing process of improvement and trying to make people happy and get results, that is what leads to great service and has people coming back. And asking for feedback is a really, really good way of doing this. And it tends to scare people a lot, but it's also one of the most incredibly valuable things that you can do. I have a client who I started working with recently who's a new mediator, and she was given an opportunity to mediate a case that looked like it would be great, but it was a horrible experience. And the mediation absolutely went south. And she was so concerned about this, she almost avoided the people who had chosen her for the mediation because she was just so embarrassed that she didn't do a good job with it. And when she reached out to them for feedback, she felt so much better about it, right? I mean, this kind of thing often happens. We build things up in our heads, I mean, for better or for worse. And when you ask for feedback, you get a much clearer perspective. And generally speaking, it's extraordinarily valuable for one's ongoing development. The final point here is making a plan, and specifically committing that plan to paper. Now, I think when people go online and look up business development plans, they can be really intimidated by this because they're often like 35 pages long, and they just look like something that would take you weeks and weeks to do correctly. But really, all you need for a plan, I mean, it could be 1 page or 2 pages, but including goals and including the basic outline of how you're planning on achieving those goals and some basic actions moving towards those goals. It doesn't have to be some elaborate thing, but having something actually written out on paper provides clarity on a different level. I mean, every small business knows that it should have a business plan, but 80% or more do not, right? They have an idea, they have some intentions in their head, but they've never committed it to paper. And when you think about it, it's like the difference between a mediation that ends up with a settlement agreement and one where they just agree verbally, right? We know that one ends up working out a whole lot better than the other. Now, although things are not going to go according to plan, right? They might go better or they might go differently, but they're not going to be exactly what you wrote down. But nonetheless, the process of writing it and thinking through it helps us prepare for whatever ends up happening, right? Because you've thought through scenarios, it helps you make better decisions and then achieve your goals faster. As Winston Churchill said, he who fails to plan is planning to fail. And I think sometimes people have trouble imagining how coaching relates to business development. So I just like to add in a couple points here of what the kinds of things that I do with people. So in addition to strategy and messaging, which are certainly all very important, I help people increase courage and resilience reframe an aversion to sales to find an approach that feels authentic but still effective. Address perfectionism, which is a huge issue, certainly for lawyers, but for a lot of other people as well. I mean, perfectionism is a fantastic quality, and it can help you be excellent at whatever you do. But if you're applying that in the realm of business development, you're going to make yourself insane, because this is not an area where perfection is helpful because there is no such thing as perfection. And there's also, very often it's hard to stay on track with one's goals because, we change our minds, or we have too many interests, or we have ADHD. There's a whole lot of things that get in the way of people actually, having the plan and then fulfilling on it. So I work with people on all those kinds of things. I just want to leave you all, I'm going to take questions in a moment, but leave you all with this quote, which I like. It's from Grace Bumbry, who's an opera singer. And she says, "I've gone from reluctance to acceptance to gung-ho." Now, apparently, although she loved to sing, she did not used to like to sing in front of audiences, but she managed to pull herself forward and went from not liking it to being really enthusiastic. And that's my experience with business development. I hated it at first, and I've worked with a lot of people who have a huge aversion to it, who are able to put that aside and start doing it in a way that feels really satisfying and even fun. So just a reminder that that's possible. I would love to hear from you. These are different ways to connect with me. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I don't know if people want to unmute themselves.
Yeah, Anna, that's a really good point. If you do have a question for Anna, if you'll just state your name and then give her your question. And while we're waiting for folks to ask Anna questions, I do have a question. I've heard a lot about the use of social media and building your network. Can you talk about how we might be able to use social media to expand our a net to get referrals?
Yeah, I mean, social media is certainly a tool some people use to develop their practices. But, just because when you think about it, right, getting people to know, like, and trust you, when you meet people in person, it's a lot easier to develop trust than it is if you're just seeing, some random things people are writing on Twitter or LinkedIn or something. And so in order to be effective, and it can be effective, like social media absolutely can be effective, but you need to be super consistent with your use of it. And it tends to be a much higher bar to get people to know who you are. So like if you are, if you have a very specific expertise and you want people to know that you are an expert and you are blogging and you are tweeting and you're forwarding other people's tweets on the same subject. I mean, if you're establishing yourself as an expert and you're doing this consistently over time, that can attract clients. But what I find for most people is that that social media, like I think it feels safe for people. It feels safer than going out and talking to people in their communities, people they know, talking about, what they're doing and asking people to keep them in mind for business. And so it certainly can be effective, but you have to be really deliberate and really consistent. And overall, actual human contact generally works better.
During the course, this is Eileen again, during the course of your practice and working with people, have you come across where mediators or professionals use like newsletters through email, to kind of get their message out or to market their practice?
I don't find that mediators tend to use newsletters so much, just because Well, I mean, I suppose it could work, but just because the way things are now, if people are looking for information about something, they're either going to a very specific place where they already know that that experts tend to write or speak on a subject, right? Like a conference or a specific magazine or something like that, or they're searching the web, right? They Google whatever it is they're looking for and they see what comes up. So it's certainly valuable to stay connected, but because the nature of mediation and arbitration, the focus doesn't tend to be so much on information. I find people don't use newsletters as much, although one could, I suppose. I never say never for different approaches, because, you know, just because nobody's done something or few people have done it, it doesn't mean that it can't be successful. Like I met a woman in Texas, actually, who had gotten quite a lot of clients by putting her mediation practice on pens. You know, she'd gotten those, you know, a pen with her name and name of her company and phone number and that sort of thing. And she was leaving it in courthouses, in the like lawyers' lounges. And she got a bunch of clients, right? Like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily imagine that that would be the best approach, but it absolutely worked. So, I mean, there's different things can work for different people in different circumstances.
Thank you, Anna.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Can anyone hear me, or am I muted? Or
yes.
I think I'm off of mute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, this is Dr. Friedman, Anna. I'm totally there with everyone and everything that has just been said. This is Dr. Friedman over in Huntsville, Alabama. I've got a question for you. And oh, by the way, everyone, that's one of the oldest tricks in the book. I'm one of the ladies that took one of the transportation companies to about 30 grand to about 230 grand in a year, and about, well, maybe about less than a year. So leaving those pins, hey, that still works. But I did want to mention something. In the times that we're in with the millennials, it's all about hearing it from someone else. If you have a girlfriend and you want to talk about something great that you did, tell you what, you two pair up and let her say it about you and you say it about her. And for some reason, it's just more believable nowadays. But my question is this. I was a jack of all trades. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, everything I tried, I was good at. And so mediation is something that I had already always dreamt about. So now that I'm a law student, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I can finally do that. So when you have been doing a lot of different things, what would be your recommendation on having everyone home in on mediation for me now?
You mean in terms of explaining to people that that's what you're doing?
And that's what I plan to do exclusively. Well, you know, primarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not clear on what the concern is. Like,
well, that's going to be the biggest struggle. Yeah, because they're like, oh, well, you're good at this and you're good at that. Oh, some people may say, okay, now you're doing mediation. Okay, of course, you know, you're probably good at that, but I'm really not. I've never really done it before other than helping people here and there. So how would I break into that? I'm just clueless on that. I don't even know where to start on that.
Breaking into mediation?
Right.
Yeah.
How do I let them know? Right.
Well, I would just tell them. I mean, I think going ahead and sitting down with different people, especially, you know, maybe start with the top 10 people you know who are most influential or who are most likely to know people who might be in the market for your services. And sitting down and explaining to them your approach to, if they are familiar with mediation, talk about your approach, what you do. And if you don't know what your approach is, obviously you need to figure that out first, right? By taking classes and getting some experience and all that. But, you know, you sit down, explain to people what it is and all of that and how you approach it, because there's a lot of experienced mediators who do things very differently. So that might sound funny to someone with a little less experience, but it's actually a really valuable conversation for people who use mediators. to go, oh, that's how you do it. Okay, great. Yes, that's in alignment with, you know, how I like to work with people or something. So anyway, you sit down and have those conversations and ask them if they'd consider you know, to keep you in mind when people are looking for that kind of service. That's probably the number one thing to do is, you know, let people know and do it in a personal way where you can have genuine interaction, as opposed to like a email blast, right? A lot of people will do like, by the way, I'm opening a mediation practice, and you should send it out to everybody you know, which there's nothing wrong with doing that. You could certainly send it out to, you know, 1,000 people easily, which is fine, but the odds are you're not going to get much from that. Whereas if you sit down and have coffee or lunch with people, you know, two people a day for the next 3 months, you're probably going to get business out of that. Now, granted, it's very time consuming, but it's also that sort of personal contact tends to be much more effective.
I appreciate that very much, and I believe that's going to be the ticket, because everyone's getting inundated, you know, right now with information. So I like that a lot better. I'm going to take your advice on that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Are there any other questions?
I think we have 1 minute. Yeah, I think we have 1 minute left if anyone has one more question.
Okay, well, this is Eileen, and hearing no more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up our webinar. I do want to thank you, Anna, for an insightful and enjoyable presentation. I think you've given us some good suggestions and tips to help us in our practice. I do have the code for the Alabama State Bar when you complete your survey evaluation for the lawyers that are intending to apply for CLE. On the survey, enter ASB. That stands for Alabama State Bar, ASB 2018, ASB 2018. And I'd also like to invite everyone to visit the Alabama Center for Dispute Resolution website. It's at alabamaadr.org, and also visit our Facebook page. We are posting our trainings and free webinars on the Facebook page as well as our website. And our next free webinar is set for June 14th. With Kathleen Cobble with Book Mediation, and our topic is going to be managing a mediation business. And this gets more into the nuts and bolts of managing a business. And so we invite you to visit the website for training opportunities and other resources that may be helpful to you. Please don't forget to complete your evaluation survey, which is in the link in the email that was sent out with the registration information for this webinar. And if you would, please complete it by May 25th, which is tomorrow. We have recorded this presentation, and if all goes well, we will post it on our website. And thank you again, Anna. It was a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. And thank you to everyone for attending our webinar, and this will conclude the webinar.